Where is everyone tonight? What's the deal? I know what's going on. They think that I was doing a regular kind of like kumbaya group tonight. That's what it is.
Well,
They didn't know I was doing a lecture.
my nephew calls it, we plan things and then look
Yeah.
at the weather.
Look at the weather. Yep.
And he says you don't do that.
No.
You'll miss out on a lot of good stuff.
No, you don't want to do that.
Holds us back, but I have a feeling it might be the weather. Because it almost made me stay home.
Did it?
Yeah. Yeah. But it wasn't raining like it was when I got.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, we'll give it a couple minutes here, guys, and then we'll get the show on the road. Did you shut that door back there? All right, here we go. Pass this handy dandy sign-in sheet around. Give us your name, email, phone number, all that kind of good stuff. And we'll try to keep in contact with you. If you don't want to sign in, that's fine too. My name is Rich Jones. I'm the CEO here at FAVOR Greenville. I think I know almost everyone. My background real quick. I'm a therapist, worked in clinical services, a lot of different places, mental health clinics, drug and alcohol clinics, treatment centers, all that kind of good stuff. And I've been here at FAVOR Greenville for 5 years, and I'm also a person in long-term recovery. So for me, the issue was, it was alcohol use disorder way before the pills, but really opioids kind of brought me to my knees. But you know, I wasn't a Boy Scout kind of doing the right thing before that. I knew my way around the party. Knew how to do that. And so a lot of times people talk about going and seeing doctors and becoming addicted to prescriptions, that kind of thing. What I can tell you in my case was I was predisposed to that. And I don't know what you're dealing with your loved one or what their story is or what their circumstance is. A lot of times it does involve prescription, but in my case, I was sort of set up. I set myself up for that based on my behavior before that. And I've been in recovery for about 18 years. Now tonight, we're going to do a lecture, and we're going to go over some different topics and cover some things that people have asked us to talk about. I'm very open to questions along the way, or if there are other topics we should go through. The two areas that that have been thrown out there are stages of recovery and dealing with lapse or recurrence or a slip or whatever you want to, somebody who's been doing well for a while and then kind of falls off the wagon. That's also related to stages of recovery, so that might be the best way to kind of go through this. When it comes to family recovery, there's not a lot's been written about the stages of recovery. That doesn't get discussed. I believe families go through a similar process. Somebody talked about becoming addicted to the person's chaos. I believe a couple different things. I do believe families become kind of habitual in their response to situations. It becomes I don't want to, maybe I won't use the word addictive. That might be a little bit too strong, but it definitely becomes repetitive. It becomes, it's self-destructive. Would you agree with that? Your response to situations is not necessarily in your own best interest. In that sense, it has addictive kind of qualities or addictive nature to it. And if that's the case, if there's kind of a similar process for the families to become, whatever you want to call it, codependent or engaging in enabling behaviors, if there's a similar process to that, it stands to reason that there would be a similar process for family recovery. You probably go through similar stages. So when I go through this tonight, let's talk along the way and see if you can relate to any of this and see if you can kind of identify maybe something you're going through in your own life. The first thing we want to do real quick, we do this every week, is we talk about what is addiction. So if there's anybody new who has questions about that, you get a chance to wrap your mind around that part of the process. Let's see if I got this. I don't have this in this particular PowerPoint. Let's shut that bad boy down. Actually, let's do this. Let's save this and see if we can pull up some pictures of the brain. Because everybody, you gotta love a good old-fashioned picture of the brain, right? Let's see here. All right. So let's start with just kind of going over real quick what is addiction, what is recovery, that kind of thing, and make sure we're all on the same page. So there are a lot of people who mess around with different substances. Not everybody who messes around with a substance becomes addicted to that substance. Would you guys agree? And not everybody who messes around and gets involved in risky or dangerous use becomes addicted. Actually, the majority of people who mess around with things don't become addicted. That's just the statistical facts around the issue. About 10% of folks, 10 to 12% of folks, will kind of cross that line into addiction. And so what's the difference between heavy use and this thing that we call addiction? And really, the idea is that when a person becomes addicted to a substance, technically it's called substance use disorder severe, your brain changes. There's actual brain change that's involved, and it leads to certain symptoms and certain behaviors that aren't otherwise there for the heavy and the risky use. And I want to go on the record and tell you, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble just with risky use. When we have somebody come in, we're going to help you no matter what stage you're at, whether you're risky use or even occasional use, whatever. We don't care. We don't really want to label it because it can be a problem either way. But where substances are concerned, they affect this part of the brain right here. It's called the dopamine system. Essentially, the dopamine system, anytime you do anything pleasurable, dopamine is released, and it tells your brain, do it again. When you're doing substances, when you're taking mood or mind-altering chemicals and putting them into your body, it releases an unusual amount of dopamine. And for some of us, over time, that leads to the dysregulation of dopamine, and actually it ceases the production of dopamine. It shuts off the production of dopamine, and we no longer have the ability to experience pleasure or contentment as a result of putting these substances in our body. So if we can't experience pleasure or contentment, we are compulsively drawn to get these substances. Now, this is a very quick, kind of simplistic way of looking at this. But if it shuts off, we're gonna go after this as if it's the same as eating when you're hungry. It becomes instinctual in nature. And this is probably the best way to illustrate. This is a picture of the brain. So on my right, this is a brain kind of functioning, firing neurotransmitter. Dopamine is there. This person can experience a normal, pleasurable day. Okay? Not euphoria, just what? Contentment. If you go outside, it's a beautiful day. Hey, everything's cool. You feel all right about this. You go to your family's house for Thanksgiving. Everybody's there. You're good with it. You're not super high. You're not super low. You're content. You guys know what I mean by content? Okay. Now, if this is shut off, if the production of the neurotransmitter that allows you to feel pleasure and contentment is shut off, can you see how you would be drawn to try to pour something in there to feel a little bit better? This explains Uncle Joe passing out in the mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving every year. He's in a desperate state of affairs. Everyone else is drinking one glass of wine, doing their thing. kind of having a little bit of fun. Uncle Joe or Uncle George or Uncle Rich, whatever it is drawn to fill up this empty bucket. So what does he do? Glass after glass after glass. Or even if it's other substances, sneaking off and doing other things, just looking for a way to feel any of that pleasure and contentment. And that's what leads to all the strange and puzzling behaviors that you guys have all experienced. That's the difference between I'm partying and I'm having a good time, just having a little bit of fun with my buddies, to I'm using despite the fact that it could kill me. I'm using despite the fact that it's destroying my family. I'm using despite the fact that my probation officer's coming over and I could go back to jail. It's because you're trying to fill this empty bucket. And when does this happen? How does it happen? Who does it happen to? It's like any other disorder or any other disease. It's not going to happen to everybody who goes at it hard. There's no guarantee. There's certain things that help predict it. It does run in families, so there's about a 40 to 60% more likelihood you're going to develop it if it's in your family. Age of first use has a lot to do with it, how old you are when you first start. The substance that you're using, certain substances are more addictive than others, but not everybody has this happen. And the problem is that none of us really actually, I've never got, this is not my brain. I don't know what my brain, I'm sure my brain is just firing on all kinds of cylinders. Right? Just all kinds. But I can't show this to somebody who has this issue. So if Debbie comes in and I'm saying, hey, here's what's going on. This is the criteria. It looks like you meet criteria for this. We recommend you get treatment. We recommend you get help. What do a lot of people do? That's not me. Here's why it's not me. This is not diagnosis in the classic sense where, like, if I have a broken leg, they show me my broken leg and I get a cast on and I go do my thing. Really hard for people to recognize this, especially early on, especially the younger they are. The term denial, that's what that's all about. How do you get the person to actually recognize that the issue's there? Now, sometimes people recognize the issue's there and they still don't want to change. But many times people aren't willing to say that they've crossed the line into this issue. And this is what's called addiction. Now, any questions about that part of the process? Especially if you're new and you haven't really heard this yet. Any questions about how that happens or anything I can clarify? This is important because if you're dealing with somebody who is addicted to a substance, they are doing strange things. They are doing things that are dangerous. They are doing things that are self-destructive. They are doing things to you. They're treating you in ways that they shouldn't be treating you. They're saying things that they shouldn't be saying. And you need to understand, and I'm not saying this because I'm making excuses for anyone. This is very important. I'm not making an excuse for anyone. You just need to know what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with somebody who's in the right frame of mind because of this particular issue. Yes, ma'am.
Can it be reversed?
It can be reversed. So it takes time. It doesn't take as long as people may think. When you enter into recovery, you stop putting the substances in your body. You start doing certain things related to recovery. Depends on what you're doing. There are certain things that have been proven to kind of help with this. Therapy, for example. Support groups. Being in group settings seems to help in a lot of different ways. It lifts people up. Prayer, meditation, exercise. You take care of yourself, you come back online quicker. This is not a permanent condition. This is very good news. This is not a permanent condition. You make a comeback. I am fully functioning. Make no mistake about that. But how long did it take? I don't know. I wish I could kind of rewind the clock and I knew then what I know now and I could kind of look at this and say maybe it was 60 days, maybe it was 90 days. I know it didn't take a year for me. It was probably like a 90-day thing where I felt but it's kind of slowly but surely over time where you start to feel better. Great question. You do make a comeback. What other questions about this process? This is not depression, guys. This is not serotonin. This is not that issue. This is the neurotransmitter dopamine. So it's not depression. The person doesn't feel depressed. They feel completely restless. They feel discontent. Nothing is okay. Now, if you're dealing with certain substances like opioids or alcohol or benzodiazepines, Xanax and stuff like that, on top of this, you're also experiencing physical withdrawal. So now you're sick because you don't have the substance. You're mentally obsessed, psychologically obsessed because these neurotransmitters have changed. And again, that goes back to that desperate seeking behavior that doesn't make sense to any of us. Anyone else? Yes, Carol.
I've been hearing a little bit lately about it's a learning disorder.
Yes, that's a new theory that's out there. And the truth about, there's a person who wrote a book, her name is Maya Salvitz. She wrote a book called Unbroken Brain. I read the book. I think it's a fantastic book. And her idea is that this neurotransmitter issue or this neurobiological issue is actually not a neurotransmitter. It's a learning disorder. But when you read that stuff, it's very, very similar to this. It still has to do with the dysregulation of neurotransmitters. And her idea is that because of the dysregulation, those of us who become addicted, we don't understand the connection between cause and effect. We lose the ability. I almost think it's another way of saying what I just said. To be honest, when I read her stuff, it still has everything to do with the brain. So whether you want to call it a learning disorder or you want to use the word disorder, and you don't like the word disease because some people don't like the word disease, I don't really care what you call it. Can you get in touch with the idea that something happens in the person's brain that makes it more than just a choice? That makes, where it goes and it moves into this area of compulsion. You guys know what I mean by compulsion? Seeking it despite your own kind of self-destruction. Constantly thinking about it. Using it in a different way. So you could go and you could have a party and, guys are in college, people are in college doing their thing and they're going at it, they're going out, tailgating, whatever it is, and you can go at it hard, but whenever it's time to walk away from it, it's neither here nor there. It might have been a bad night, but when you're done, you're done. The difference is when it was a bad night and I was done, the very first thing that happened to me was, when am I doing that again? And not only when am I going to do it again, I'm going to find something to kind of to emulate that or to touch that even though it's Wednesday afternoon. Do you follow me? That's the difference. And I knew guys like that, and you guys know people like that. You know people who were just off the chain, and they just stop. They get a job, they get married, they do their thing. And then those of us who kind of cross the line into this situation, we could benefit from some type of specialty care. We could benefit from some type of intervention. We could benefit from some type of conversation. Some people figure it out on their own, but we believe you need to have some support around you just to make it more likely that you're going to be able to get it done. What other questions about this part of the process? Carol, where have you been seeing this idea of it being this whole learning disorder issue?
I heard it somewhere and then I read the book.
Yeah, so that's, I don't want, part of the problem with that is it's a very nuanced conversation, and the deal is it's still the same. It's still the same. Something happens in a person's brain. We can't get away. We have to make sure we don't talk about this in all these different directions and all these different theories to where the public is kind of like, that's Rich's choice. And family members are thinking that this because they don't love me enough, or I just haven't done the right thing, or I've been a bad mom, or that we want to make sure that we're clear that this is about a brain change. And I think that something like this is helpful in that regard. Even if you don't know the ins and outs and you're not 100% sure what to call this or what to call that, there's something up with that, right? Okay. And the criteria, guys, as you go through it, we're not going to diagnose anybody at FAVOR Greenville, but there's 11 different criteria that sort of indicate whether or not a person has crossed the line into substance use disorder severe. Tolerance, using more and more of the same substance to get the same effect. So you used to take 2 pills, now you're taking 4 pills. Or you used to drink 3 beers, now you're drinking 13 beers to get the same effect. Withdrawal, when you don't have the substance, you're sick. Craving and preoccupation is an internal process. You think about it all the time. It's on your mind all the time. You guys have had cravings for certain things, right? Donuts or like Oreo cookies or whatever you're into, man. Magnify that by about 10 or 15. Can't control. You intended to drink a couple drinks and go home. You wound up staying up all night. You woke up in Las Vegas 4 days later with Mike Tyson and a tiger. I have to say that every single time. Can't cut back. You make rules for yourself and you can't follow them. This is a big deal. This is the one that you can get the most mileage when you're talking to somebody if they make rules that they can't follow themselves. So if I say I'm only going to drink on the weekends and I'm still drinking every day of the week, that's an inability to control. That is inability to cut back. That's a very, very telltale sign. Interpersonal issues, people are angry at you about your using. You avoid non-using activities. You don't go places where there's no alcohol, where there's no drugs. Great deal of time. It's a full-time job. Use despite physical or psychological dangers. Maybe you have a liver problem. You've been told quit drinking and you keep drinking. Use in physically hazardous situations. Operating heavy machinery. Skydiving. Driving under the influence. Role failure due to use. You don't show up for school. You don't show up for work. If you meet 6 of those criteria, 6 out of 11, you technically meet the criteria. It's a pattern in any given year. You technically meet the criteria for substance use disorder severe. The word addiction does not appear in the medical literature. It doesn't exist. So it's alcohol use disorder severe, opioid use disorder severe, methamphetamine use disorder, whatever the drug is at the beginning. And this would be the equivalent of addiction if you meet 6 out of those criteria. The person would have to recognize that themselves and process that themselves. Any questions about the criteria? All right, why do I inform you this? Not so you can go home and diagnose your loved one. That's not what this is about. It's an awareness issue, right? It's an awareness of like what might be going on, how this is moving from maybe this particular kind of, hey, we were worried about him, we were worried about her, into this something like, yeah, okay, something's up. This is just some of the guidelines related to that. Any final comments about what is addiction? Or any questions? Anybody have any questions about that part of this process that I can clear up here? All right. And we will go back to the original PowerPoint, which I don't even know where it is. Let's see. Look at my desktop. That's pretty freaking intimidating, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, it is. All right. I think it's...
I couldn't find anything.
Okay, well, hey, listen, guys. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. I got, a little bit of an ADHD issue. I'm working on it. Don't judge me. All right, let's see here. Sorry about this. Give me a second. Let's do name. There we go. There's my old desktop. No better, right? And if we do this, see?
Yeah.
I think I can
There's
find.
a method to the madness.
There's a method to the madness unless that's not it. Nope, that's it. You got to give me credit on that. Give me a hand. Did you see what just went on? I just found that thing by moving those icons around based on what date versus name. Holy cow. All right. So let's go back to the original idea then. Now we know what addiction is. And we kind of, we talked about how that happens to a person. Some of the questions that came up were, what do we do? What do we expect when the person enters into recovery? What are the stages of recovery? What's the process involved? What does that look like? And then I kind of sort of stretched it a little bit to say, like, I believe there's also similar stages in terms of family recovery. Now let's start off with this idea. The brain that I just showed you is a person. It's not a family member. That's a person who is in addiction. If you were to look at a family member's brain and you were sort of to study that, there's different ways of thinking, like how does this go on? What happens? Some people kind of call it learned behavior. Have you guys heard the term codependency? That's part of the description of it, and some of that might be true. Another way of thinking of it is a trauma response. And a trauma response is whenever certain behaviors and certain responses and certain situations get encoded in your brain as being dangerous, as being traumatic. And if you look at something like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, or acute stress disorder, it literally says exposure to a life-threatening event for yourself or a loved one. So you start to think about addiction, and you start to think about substance use disorder, and what that's like for a family member going through that. It's repetitive exposure to a life-threatening event for a loved one. Would you guys agree with that? Why is it a repetitive exposure? It doesn't happen just once. It happens over and over again. And many times it's pretty extreme. Not all the time, but many times. And in today's world, where we hear about it every single day, it's very natural for parents to react, for spouses to react. That this is life-threatening. And what that does, guys, is that encodes in your mind. It literally becomes like a neural pathway. And it becomes a connection. And so what happens is that there's a behavior, okay, something goes down. There's an automatic connection in the loved one's brain. Then there's a behavior that releases the tension. Do you guys follow that? You guys get that? One more time. So what happens is that you have a behavior. What do I mean by behavior? Let's say the person has been in recovery for a while and they go back out and they use. They use one time. Let's say that those are the facts. So what is the behavior? What's the incident? What's the trigger? Let's use the word trigger. What's the trigger? The person has used one time. What's the encoded connection? The encoded connection is not one time. What is it? It's all that other stuff that went on. You literally, the memories will flood your brain. The feelings that you used to have when the person have gone through it will flood your brain. It won't just be analytical on your part, and it's automatic. This is where it does get similar to addiction. That is an automatic response. Just like if I'm triggered, when I was in early recovery, if I would have seen a prescription pill bottle, what do you think would have happened to me? I would have been automatically triggered, and the thought would have been, I got to get a hold of that. So the same thing with the family. I'm automatically triggered, and that it creates internal tension. It creates this tension and fear and anxiety that can be relieved by a behavior. What kind of behavior could relieve that? Calling the person, driving over their house, stalking them, putting a CIA agent on them, following them around. Do you follow me? Like all that stuff releases.
Find my iPhone.
What's that?
Find my iPhone.
Find the iPhone.
Yes,
You know, so why does it release it? It releases it for a couple different reasons. Maybe sometimes you get the answer you want. You find out that they're okay. Other times it just distracts you from the internal tension. So now you start to have this automatic behavior related to any kind of trigger that, and when I say any kind of trigger, you got to remember, it could be the obvious triggers, like the person smells like alcohol, or you think they're, or it could be like a very subtle trigger. It could literally be, the trigger could be calm. Calm. Because in the past, when things were calm, what would happen? Excuse my language, but the shit would pop off, right? It would pop off, man. Like everything would be okay, but if you relaxed, this is what you're telling yourself, if I relax and I take a breath, I'm getting a phone call. Or I'm hearing about this. And so even to your point earlier when you were saying you feel like you're addicted to the situation because the calm even get... I would say what's going on is your brain is automatically associating that with what could happen. And you got to remember, guys, that's 100% like a natural response. That's how our brains work. Our brains are conditioned to remember those things in order to protect us. So you are hyper-vigilant and hyper-sensitive to these situations. If you don't pay attention to them, they will happen underneath your consciousness, and you will. This is where also some of the behaviors that have been labeled enabling kind of come in. This is why somebody would give somebody $100 to try to like get them to calm down, because in their mind, anger, frustration, the person's flipping out equals he's going to go get high equals he's going to die. So there's all these connections that mimic addiction. So how about if we think about it that way? Can we all agree that we'll think about it that way for tonight? Because that'll work a lot with this recovery thing. Whether we think it's exactly like that or not, we can all agree that family members also become involved in very self-defeating behaviors. And they do things that they're against their own judgment. I mean, how many of you said, I'm not going to do A, B, C, or D. I am no longer going to fill in the blank, whatever that is. And then that thing happened 15 minutes after you just said it, and you did the exact opposite of what you just said. You all have done that. You don't have to make eye contact or anything like that, but we know we have. Just is what it is. All right, so what happens when a person kind of enters into recovery? And let's see, we'll do this together and we'll talk about whether or not it translates to family members or not. All right. So the first thing that goes on for anybody is they're in active addiction, or maybe a family member's in active, kind of like that trauma response or that active behavior, and you're kind of going, picture it's like a train going down the track, out of control. The first thing that has to happen is the brakes got to be put on the train. There has to be some type of period of stabilization. Something has to happen to slow this thing down, to bring this thing to a halt, to make a change, right? Stabilization in the case of a person like me is things like detox. Maybe it's rehab. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just I put it down and I'm at home and I start going to meetings. But do you see, like, it has to stop. Something has to go on. The same thing can happen with family members. You can go about your business dealing with this issue and doing the same thing over and over and over again on automatic pilot for decades, almost unaware that anything's different, that anything's negative. And what's the thing that makes any of us change? It's this idea of somebody kind of confronting us. You become aware of what's going on. Now I go to detox. Family members don't have the benefit of going to detox, although I don't know if I've shared with this group my business idea that I have. I call it reverse intervention. Hear me out on this. This is how this works. So what we do is, you got the person, they're in active addiction. You get all your family members together and you get in a circle and you sit there and you have me as the professional and I'm there to do the intervention. And your loved one comes in and you have written letters on what they're doing and all these other kind of things. And as you go through it, you read your letters. Hey, last Christmas you stole my Xbox, and this or that. You started a fight at the Thanksgiving dinner, and you get to the end, and then you say, and that's why we're going to rehab. And then the family gets up and goes and gets in a van and goes off to an airport, flies to Panama. Now when you go to rehab, your cell phone is taken from you. You're not allowed to talk to anybody. Can you imagine how wonderful that would be? Maybe we'll go to a place where they have acupuncture and equine therapy, and you get to go to lectures all day. Now this does exist for families related to other things. You can go, people, it's very rare, but some people do go to a facility, but families also go through some type of stabilization and detox. Typically it happens in programs like this, where you actually learn, maybe for the first time, or maybe it gets confirmed that there's something wrong here. And I can't continue to do this way. That's that first phase. You learn to go to a group, and you're okay with going to a group. That's both of us. You guys were probably very uncomfortable when you first started coming here. Some of you have been coming for a while. Others are relatively new. But anytime you come to any kind of program like FAVOR, Faces and Voices of Recovery, or whether it's Al-Anon, or whether it's an AA meeting for me, or whatever it is, the first time you go, it's very uncomfortable. So that's also part of the stabilization process. You get here, you find out it's okay, you find out people are kind, they're nice, this isn't as bad as you thought. You break the pattern of isolation. So for us, isolation is kind of obvious, right? Our world becomes smaller and smaller because we might be around people, but it's typically people we're using with. Does the family isolate? The family isolates for different reasons, but they absolutely do. You find out they stop going places. They don't want to run into anybody. They don't want to talk to somebody at the grocery store. Hey, how's so-and-so doing? So you start to avoid that. You start to shut down. The other thing that happens, we develop healthy role models for recovery. I go to meetings, I hear people talk, I say, I want to be like that, I can relate to that guy. Same thing probably happens to you guys. There are people who you start to hear similar circumstances with their family, but they seem like they're okay. And they become healthy, positive role models. Anxiety management is a big deal. We'll talk a little bit about some techniques related to that, but both family and individual needs to learn how to deal with what? Worry, stress, anxiety. We need to learn how to deal with it without what? Picking up. You need to learn how to deal with it without rescuing, or maybe becoming frustrated, or like I said earlier, putting a tracking device in the person while they sleep. That's a little bit of a joke, but it's kind of disturbing because some of you were like, Like when I said that, man, I don't know if you guys know this or not. I literally just said putting a tracking device in them while they sleep, and some of y'all went. Like I'm not sure if that means yeah, I did that or good idea. There's certain things I don't want to know, so let's keep that to ourselves. Another thing is staying away from risky people, places, and things. For us, those are the triggers. Those are the bars. Those are the places where they're selling drugs, that kind of thing. For family members, what would be some of the things that would fall into this for family members? What would be some triggers for family members? Anybody got any theories or ideas? Yes, sir.
Sure. Friends that think addiction.
That's a huge one.
A weakness or a character.
Judgmental folks who are going to kind of give you a speech about what you should be doing with your kid. People who might not believe that this is a brain issue. People who might want to judge. People who make you feel worse about yourself. Other risky situations would be, let's say, for example, that you really are kind of over the top with phone calls or text messages or being at the person's house. Sometimes you have to put physical distance between yourself and the person. Some people will go off to rehab, for example, and the family will kind of step back. That's a really good idea sometimes. The person themselves can kind of be a trigger. Developing self-responsibility, learning to ask for help. Again, we can all buy that this happens for both of us, right? Now the question is, what are the time frames for that? Stabilization, you could say, is a week to 30 days, that kind of thing. 7 to 30 days. It's usually that initial part. You're getting your head about, if you're a person in recovery, you're literally getting your head about you for the first time in a long time. You're able to kind of think a little clearer. It's not a period of time where you're able to take stock of your behavior. You're still going to be very self-absorbed if you're a person in recovery during the stabilization phase. You're literally only focused on trying to what? Not use that day. You're not thinking about bigger picture kind of issues. Any questions about the stabilization phase? Yes?
We have a son that's not really kind of grasp that he needs to do these things yet.
Right.
He's in Marshall Pickens, supposed to get out tomorrow for trying to self-harm himself, but it's just triggers of taking things away from him that triggered all this whole stuff. But he's taking the Zans and drinking.
Yeah.
And smoking. So it gets out tomorrow morning. This whole stabilization process, of he's going to be self-absorbed. He's focused on only wanting to come home, get his phone, have his belongings.
Yeah.
That's
How old is he?
19.
19, okay.
So
All right, so it's a great question, and unfortunately it's not uncommon.
yeah, and I want to trigger more.
Like anxiety,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to.
handle that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, sir?
Yeah, we went through that several times.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dr. Roddy was really good, but still, he's going to come out and he's just going to get into it and flip out again just before he can turn around. Our son got to where the last time was like 12 hours. It went from 3 weeks to 12 hours after 3-4 times.
So, well, let's do one thing. We can't generalize all experiences, but that is a possibility. And actually for his age, that's a distinct possibility. A lot of the guys, the age does have something to do with this recovery process. That's just a fact. The younger you are, the harder it is for it to kind of click in. Because you have all those issues that go along with adolescence, which is invincibility. You know everything. You don't want to listen to people. There's a little bit of like this kind of like oppositional behavior that a lot of times, especially boys have it, that kind of thing.
And I mean, he doesn't have hardly, like, staying away from risky places, people. He really doesn't have anybody.
So he's not hanging with anybody.
I mean, he has people. They're just
The wrong people.
the wrong people.
Yeah. Yep. Go
We
ahead.
had high hopes that what I was trying to get is, we had high hopes when he came out after the first or second time that everything would work.
Yeah.
And,
But I guess they have to want it. I mean,
you have to want it, and you really have to be on your guard, and not putting too much on yourself.
Yeah, and you'd have to think, okay, what's the reality of the situation? What could be going on with a 19-year-old when they come out of any facility, and how are we going to respond if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So the question starts to become less about what's he going to do, because you can't control that, to what are we going to do if he doesn't continue the stabilization process. Now, people continuing to stabilize, you don't have to be in a facility for 30 days to continue the stabilization process. People do it by going to meetings. They do it by seeing their therapist. They do it by, going to see a psychiatrist. It's kind of more predictable if they're in a facility. But on your end, you'd have to kind of go back to this idea of what are our boundaries and how do we respond if he doesn't
When you were
do
doing
what
the
he
whole
needs.
thing about like if you relapse, I completely, my brain goes back to all the other past things he's done when he's told me, oh, well, I'm X, Y, and Z, I'd immediately go to that place.
Yeah. Yes. And so what is it, and everybody in this room can apply this to their particular situation. What is it, what is the thing that you know for sure that has crossed the line and that you're just not going to be able to stand for and you're not going to be able to watch, right? And what can you do when the person goes there? So for some people, that's using one time. For some family members, that's so-and-so used one time. He's going to have to leave or go to rehab. Do you follow me? That's not for everyone, though. You have got to figure out what you're okay with and what you want your personal boundaries to be, and your personal boundaries may be completely different than mine. You cannot set your boundaries based on what I say because you have to implement them, I don't. Does that make sense, guys? I can stand up here and tell you do this or do that, but it doesn't really matter what I think because I'm not the one who actually has to follow through. I need to know what I'm going to do if my daughter has an issue or if my son has an issue. I need to know what my boundaries are, but I can't tell you what yours should be. But whatever that is, you got to talk about it. You got to get it clear in your mind. You got to say, whenever the person goes up against that, here's what we're going to do. And, kind of everything else that happens before that, you're sort of saying we can tolerate. And I don't know what that is, for people.
I was just going to say, if he's not doing something for recovery, it's so easy, especially if they're doing the Xanax and all that stuff, I think slide right back into it really fast. It's my experience. I've seen it with my son.
I mean, he didn't go voluntarily. He went voluntarily, but not really.
So here's the thing. Let's just be straight. Let's just be 100% straight. 19-year-olds typically don't do recovery. Okay? I would not have entertained that when I was 19. How did I not wind up in places like Marshall Pickens when I was 19? Probably because my mom did not implant a tracking device in me, and there were no technology. We got away with a bunch of stuff when I was a kid. Also, we weren't popping Xanax. It wasn't an available issue, and there was no fentanyl or carfentanil, and we just sort of ran. I'll be honest with you. You would have never got me to even consider it when I was 19. So you got to be real honest that that's probably how this goes down. And so the strategy starts to become, can we get this? Do you want me to just give you advice? Just straight up advice? Okay. Well, I don't like telling people what to do, but you guys heard me. You heard her. She asked for it directly. Okay. Here's what I would do. This is what I would do. I would try to get him to, I would kind of try to hook him into some type of recovery plan or recovery process, and I wouldn't make it be perfect. I wouldn't say it has to be perfect. And what do I mean by perfect? Like a perfect recovery plan post Marshall Pickens would be something like a meeting every day and a therapist. Get him to do something. Get him to come here tomorrow. Make him come to FAVOR Greenville at noon. Or if he's not out in time to come to FAVOR Greenville at noon, get him here the next day at noon. Because that's our all recovery meeting. Tell him, while he's telling you how he has to call so-and-so and he's telling you he has to do this, that he has to come to this meeting, and tie it to that and start trying to hold him accountable around his attendance to recovery meetings and less to what's he doing. Do you follow me? And unless it's obvious, because some people it's very, very obvious, right? You just can't even, for sure what they're up to. And then the idea would be that he would start to try to get around folks who might be able to help guide him in that process. And then the second thing is, you just said it, you said you had to kind of make him go. You had to commit him, right?
Well, we had a situation where we called the police and they talked to him and he voluntarily went.
Okay.
But but it was either that or they were going to arrest him and take him.
Okay.
So,
That's the other part of it. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to be prepared to do that again. Sometimes
that's the only first time we've done it.
Yeah.
We've been dealing with this for 2 years off and on.
Yeah.
This is progressively getting worse.
Yeah.
So he says he has a problem. He knows what he's doing is wrong, but it's back to maybe it's that brain thing.
Yeah.
You know, he's just.
Debbie?
Yeah, so if you can get him to come here to the all recovery meetings at noontime, like Rich mentioned, he's going to meet up with people his age.
Who are not doing
That's
this.
They're
what
not
help.
doing it. I don't.
Well,
want
some of them are, some of them aren't. I mean, they're not all perfect.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But that might help. So, you know,
Well, and also, what's the alternative? The alternative is that he does. I mean, if he's going to do everything he's supposed to do, then run with that, obviously, because they're going to have a recommendation for him too. Just so you know that they will have a recommendation for him.
Okay.
It'll probably be something to do with what's called intensive outpatient therapy. And you know, if he's going to do that, run with that. What I'm suggesting is that if he doesn't do, if it's kind of like you want to sell the car for $50,000, but if you can't get $50,000 for it, maybe you take $25,000.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Especially under the theory or the idea that he could benefit from being around some people in recovery.
How long
Yeah.
is the thing at Marshall?
It's only like 7 days.
He was just. It's been like 5 days. It was today.
Yeah, it's very short. Very short.
Do you control his cell phone, that you make him come into meetings contingent on keeping it?
Because that's what's kind of set us off because we took his phone away.
I mean, the plan is you turn it off.
Well, who pays for it? That's another question.
We did.
You turn it off.
Okay, so everybody in the room who's saying that, understand you did not do all that stuff whenever y'all were doing with your kid. It doesn't work that way. Y'all are armchair quarterbacking. It's very easy to be like, hey, turn that shit off, man. But when your kid was doing it, it was like, he's left-handed. We can't do it. He's left-handed. I mean, it's right. I mean, there are obvious things to do. There are absolutely obvious things that any parent can do to try to get their child to do certain things. I'm assuming that you guys have done that because you sort of suggested that you did. He escalated, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that be real aware that could happen again. Now there is a difference though. You did call the police, which is a real good move, and sometimes that helps. And then the only other thing I would throw out there is, can he get around any kind of recovery meeting? Can he get around, if he goes to IOP, then run with it. Run with it. That's their recommendation. I would imagine they're going to recommend, it's called intensive outpatient therapy. It'll probably be at Marshall Pickens, believe it or not. And I would say go ahead and do that if he'll go. I guess I'm throwing out there this idea is if he won't.
Yeah.
If he won't. One of the things that I did right when I was dealing with my daughter was I was very, very, very straightforward on what I could do and what I couldn't do. When I went to have some conversations with the therapist as we were getting ready to do this discharge thing, I went in and right off the jump I said I'm not kicking her out of my house no matter what. And I said it with her sitting right there, and so. There was not going to be, I just wasn't going to do that. I just know that enough about myself. Now, that isn't to say if it happened 5 more times, I wouldn't. Do you guys get where I'm coming from? But where I'm at in the moment, one of the best things we can do, guys, is just be honest with ourselves. But where we're at with this process. What I have found is that as you go through it, so let's say this happens 4 more times, your demeanor is going to be very different while you're sitting there. You guys get that? You're going to have a very different experience once you've gone through this a couple times, where you're probably going to be like, okay, that's it. Phone, car, boom, gone, that kind of thing. But early on, and when a person's like 19 and you're at the beginning of this journey, you have a lot more doubts.
Yeah.
And that Xanax and alcohol to me is one of the worst things I've seen.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of the most popular
it
things.
makes them do some things they would normally not do, tear up your house, beat
Yeah.
you all up, whatever it might be. So at the end of the day, you got to protect yourself, no matter what.
And I just want him to get to a point where he can see whatever the root cause of why he started using these things. Because there's a reason.
Maybe. Maybe.
They're, really?
Really, like it
There
could
be
there,
no
It could be
reason?
at a party.
it could have a lot to do with just it could have a lot to do with availability.
Yeah, but what was he, we started using smoking pot, doing that stuff because he felt of something that within him. It was
So
filling.
one of the things you want to be cautious of, and this is just for your own kind of like your own anxiety and stuff. There is no magic bullet to unlock. That's really not what's going on here. What happens is people use for a wide variety of reasons, and literally, like, he may not even be addicted yet. He's only 19. What you want him to do, he could be too. I'm not saying he's not.
Doing it for probably a year or so.
Yeah, so he could be. I mean, there's no way for me to know that. And so what I would encourage you to do, and again, you should think about this more than anything, would be to, and maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's not even a meeting. Can you get him with somebody who is going to help him figure this out? Maybe it's some of the underlying issues, but also even more than the underlying issues, or on top of the underlying issues, the behaviors themselves, other than the two of you, because the two of you are mom and dad, right? And you cannot be the case manager, you can't be the therapist. So how do you get the person to do that? Really is where I go. It's what you suggested earlier, Brown. People who do recovery-related things tend to get a little bit better. People who don't do recovery-related things tend to get a little bit worse. So you got to. What I would encourage you to do is sort of use your skills or your influence with him to get him to do something. Now again, they're going to give you some recommendations. They will probably hook you up with some information. I will make sure we give you our on-call in the event that they don't give you a therapist, for example. If you don't have a therapist, you can always call us and we can help you get with a therapist. If you're very concerned that there's other stuff going on, maybe that's the way to go. Do you guys understand what I mean? So if you feel like you have a loved one and maybe they've gone through trauma or maybe they've gone through other things, individual therapy is very effective in that regard. Maybe that's where you want to push in a person. The meeting itself is not going to get to the deep issues, guys. I mean, you're in a room full of 50 people, 30 people, that kind of thing. But good stuff, good questions. Apply that to whatever you're dealing with. And the most important part is what? Make sure whatever you say to him, you're going to be able to follow through on. Does that make sense? Make sure whatever you say, whatever the boundary is, you're going to follow through. You're better off not even going there if you don't think you can do it. That's where I said about I'm not going to ask anybody to leave the house or anything like that. But think, maybe you can come up with some things where maybe it is the phone. Maybe it's just, if he doesn't do what he's going to do, maybe it's the car, whatever it is. It's all kinds of different things. Just be real honest with yourself on what that's like. All right, stage 2, guys. After you're stabilized, you go through a process where you become more committed to your recovery. You start attending meetings on a more regular basis. You start to identify old behaviors. This is the stage where you start to take stock of some of the selfishness, some of the past behaviors, and you start to try to treat the world in a little bit of a different way. The problem with this is that it is at different times for different people. Sometimes this will happen really kind of quickly for some folks where they jump in. Sometimes it takes a year for this to happen. Sometimes it takes longer than that. Sometimes you feel like your loved one never gets to this stage. Emotional detox is the idea that they finally kind of work through some stuff, maybe some underlying issues, and have you ever seen, what I mean by an ugly cry? Everyone know it? Snot flying everywhere, that kind of thing. Emotional detox, changes in verbal attitude, feeling, and behavior. I think this is what you're talking about. The person starts to maybe be a little bit different to the world. They start to treat people a little bit different. Is that what you mean? Increase in the quality of physical health, that's natural, right? You stop doing this stuff. Increasing the ability to tolerate feelings. Maybe you're a little bit more. You're a little bit better with your anger management. You're a little bit better with your sadness. You can handle all these things better. Increasing commitment on working recovery. This is kind of like, let's just say for sake of argument, 60 days to a year. But again, I don't think that's fair to even say for sure. The person gets this, guys. How do I want to say this? It's very hard to get this if you're not around recovering people. If all you do is put the substance down and you don't go see a therapist or you don't go to meetings or you don't go around a coach, how do you get to that stuff? Do you follow me? How do you know you need to work on changing your attitude if you're not around other people. So when you start to say, how does that change? A lot of that depends on what the person's doing. I had to be around other folks and kind of see what this was all about and get some direction and getting some support to understand that it was time for me to make an amends to some people. Understand that it was time to talk differently to folks. That didn't come natural for me. I had just spent the last X number of years of my life acting 100% in my own self-interest. And so I put it down, and how do I reverse field? I got to get some support with that. So in my case, I was going to 12-step meetings. For some folks, they'll come to All Recovery. For other folks, you can get it through therapy. Your problem will be if your loved one's not doing anything. It's just less likely that this is going to click in. I'm not going to tell you it can't click in. I'm not going to say that at all. Like some people, they're going to figure this out. But in my experience, the more you're doing, the more likely you are to be able to make some of these transitions. What questions about this stage or comments about this stage? What do you do if you feel like your loved one's stuck in that? Anybody have any suggestions? So what if they're not using, but they are just a pain in the butt? Right? I mean, it's better than using and being a pain in the butt. You know, you're no longer worried about that part of it. What do you do if that's the case? Anybody have any thoughts? First of all, you don't have to put up with it. You do not have to. It's not like a person is so fragile that you cannot confront them treating you badly. That's the first thing. And the reason why I say that is a lot of people have said that to me. I'm afraid if I say something, they'll get upset and they'll wind up X, Y, Z. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. That's not what this is like. So you're allowed to say, like, knock it off. Don't talk to me that way. Or what have you. The other thing is, remember that part of this also might be issues unrelated to addiction. The other thing we have to remember is that there are a lot of people out there who have a lot of problems, and it doesn't have anything to do with substance use disorder. How do I want to say this? Let me rephrase this. Excuse my language. There are a lot of assholes out there, and it has nothing to do with substance use disorder. Can we agree you can be an asshole and never have been a drug addict? You can also be an asshole after you're done using drugs. And you as family members have a right to say, knock it off. I don't want to be around you. What I would suggest is you don't turn it into this fight about addiction. Does that make sense? If you can stick to this idea of, I'm just not cool with the way you're treating me. Or another thing that happens a lot is folks will kind of check out. They'll check out of life. They'll go to rehab. They'll go to sober living. They'll do their thing. And they'll just check out of life and they won't get a job. And they won't do life. And they're just going to kind of like chill, right? Because they're in recovery. That doesn't fly either, guys. You still have to do life. Now, in an ideal world, you'd have time to recover, right? You'd have, 6 months or a year or something. But you've got to jump back into the world. The world, I remember when I realized that people were going to stop having a parade for me because I wasn't using drugs. I remember that day. Whenever, no, it wasn't just, we're happy Rich didn't throw up on anybody today. It was like, all these other things came in. How offended I was. How dare you not, here I am. Let's make a big deal. It was like that for a little bit. People were just really, really happy that I wasn't doing what I was doing. I wasn't drinking. They noticed this. But then that went away, and I had to do life. And so people in recovery have to do life. You can't live in rehab forever. Even though we might want to, or you might want your loved one to. Even if you do the whole rehab comprehensive program, I bet you that you might be able to get somewhere for a year or two. Even if you do the soup to nuts kind of program. So they're going to have to jump back in. You have got to set boundaries around how you want to be treated, just as you would with anyone else. Does anybody else have any suggestions for somebody in stage 2? Anybody have any other thoughts that they would want to share? Anybody have any experiences that they've had in that regard?
You talk a lot about the needle moving, and if the needle is moving in the right direction, then you can be a little flexible, I guess, for lack of a better word.
So this idea of progress, is there any progress going? You'll hear people talk about it doesn't have to be perfection, it can be progress. That's exactly right. If this is the way I feel. I think that's a really good point. If a person is trying, and you feel like they're trying, and even if it's going slow, and even if it's one step forward and two steps back, but you feel like they're trying, I feel like you can work with that. The problem is, if they shut down and they're not doing anything, and they're going to treat the world like crap while they're not doing anything, then I think you have a different type of conversation. Because you got to remember, man, who knows what else is going on, if it's depression, if it's anxiety, if it's trauma, but if you're working on it, it'll get better. We have no right to abuse the people around us just because we're in recovery from substance use disorder. That's not even good for us. That's not healthy for us. Yes, Carol?
So, to put it in words.
Well, what was I doing? I was communicating. What the hell does that mean? To put it in words, so what was I? Was I communicating via, I thought, was that telepathy or something? Was I communicating in some strange click language? All right, go ahead. All right.
So you're speaking to the person who's just come home from rehab, they're in stage 2 and they're acting out, they're being an ass, and they're not going to work, and they're not going to school. And you tell them that you don't like that and all that, and then they keep doing it. So what conversation would you have?
Well, I think it has everything to do with boundaries, and you start to think it's not okay for you to do that. You can't talk to me that way, and you're not going to be allowed to live here if you're going to act like that. Or I'm not paying for your phone, or I don't know, whatever it is. Now, a lot of times people won't do that because they're concerned that the person's in active addiction, and what are they going to do, right? What I'm telling you is that you're not going to put the person back in active addiction. It's not like that. You can't, if the person's recovery is that fragile that you're going to say, I don't like the way you're talking to me, and they're going to be like, I'm going to go get high, well, then we have a whole nother problem. They weren't going to make it anyway. How would you handle anyone else in your family who was treating you like that? Or how would that would be the conversation. How would you say it? If I put it in words, it would be like, knock that off. Don't talk to me that way. Don't talk to me that way. I'm not okay with it, and if you keep it up, here's the deal. None of us are perfect at setting boundaries, right? There's this idea of difficult conversations where it's hard for us to set boundaries. You guys get that? There's a lot of things that get in the way of that. We don't want to make the other person feel bad. Some of us we don't like conflict. But if you're able to get to where you're okay with that, then it would just be very straightforward. Don't overcomplicate anything. Identify the behavior that you're not okay with. Try to be as specific as possible. I don't like the way you talk to me when I ask you to do something for me. Okay? And then try to identify what your boundary is. And if you continue to do that, I don't know if we're going to be able to continue to live together. And that would be the conversation. In words. Those were words. Right? Yes.
I think also to set those boundaries that people in the family can live with. Because that's been a large struggle for my wife and I. Setting boundaries, because I have no problem executing them. She does.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Set boundaries that you can execute with and then not freak out after.
Absolutely. I don't know if you guys could hear, but you got to make sure that the boundaries that you set, you can follow through on.
I mean, both parties.
Both everybody involved, the team, in other words, whoever's significant in the home, you got to be on the same page with that. I mean, that's if I say it and my wife doesn't say it, or vice versa, then there's nothing going on there. I mean, that's just a setup for absolute disaster. That's actually going to make it worse. You're better off not saying it at all, if that's the case. Yes, ma'am.
What is beginning to make distinctions between and among feelings?
Oh, a lot of times you'll hear people talk when you're in active addiction and things like that, you start to get to a point where you kind of operate. First of all, you try to be numb. Your goal is to sort of be numb, so you don't really identify even what you're feeling. But an example would be men a lot of times. All they ever feel is anger. There's nothing other than anger. I'm going to punch a hole in the drywall. It's not ever sadness. You follow me? And you start to get to a point where you can actually tell, this isn't, I'm not mad, I'm sad. I'm not sad, I'm fearful. That kind of thing. And it's hard to do that if you're under the influence. I don't know can you guys see how hard it would be to identify emotions if you're always high? Because you're not actually feeling anything. So that's what that means. What else, guys? What else related to this? Yes, Carol.
To back up a little bit, and it takes it into stage 2, I was reading something the other day, and it said that when they first come home the first day, don't immediately give them their phone, their car, those things, because they didn't have bargaining chip. If they start acting out, well, you're not gonna get your phone back, because they'll probably not where you stop.
You could talk about all that stuff. I mean, again, I don't want to. I think there's a whole lot of different ways to approach that. I think a lot of it has to do with how many times have you been through it? Have you tried this before? But that's definitely an option. People will do. We'll kind of phase this stuff back in. I do not recommend contracts. I don't recommend like sitting down and writing down a bunch of rules or anything like that. I recommend more about communication. All right, stage 3. Let's just call this 1 year to 2 years. Connectedness. You're kind of going deeper with this thing. The depth of joy and misery can be profound. That's an interesting experience for a person in recovery. I can absolutely relate to that. I remember that. You're feeling so good. You're not doing this anymore. Let's say this is kind of when you get to a point when you sort of know that, not that you got this thing, because we don't ever want to think that way, but you're not scared. It isn't. I remember in early recovery kind of being like, is this actually going to work? Am I doing this right? And then I got to a point where I just knew, actually I say this all the time, I'm not going to use drugs or alcohol again. I'm done. I'm just simply done. And so you move from that and you start to experience all these other emotions and the depth of joy and misery. You can have like the best day of your life, and you can also have the worst day of your life. Because you're no longer able to go anesthetize yourself. You're going to feel it all, yes.
How long did it take you to say that I will never do drugs or alcohol again?
So it didn't take me long. I knew like probably literally like around 90 days.
Really?
And I wasn't supposed to say that stuff. That's not how you're supposed to talk in the group that I got recovery in. But I didn't care. I did anyway. And it's just because I just knew. And for me, what happened was my identity changed, guys. So for me, what went on was, at a very profound level, I'm just a dude who doesn't do drugs or alcohol. I can't explain it. It's like no more complicated for me than that. I don't want to say repulsed by that lifestyle, but to a certain degree, that's the best way I can say it. It's just not who I am. I don't want to be about that anymore. Whereas before, I was all about that, right? That's all I could think about. So it was relatively early.
No, because that's what my daughter is experiencing right now.
Now, I will tell you, though, I kept doing what I was supposed to do and going to around people and going to therapy and stuff, not because I thought I was going to get high,
Right.
but because I needed to get benefits other than getting high. I think this is an important thing to note. If getting recovery was just about stop drinking or stop using, I mean, to a certain degree, that's the easiest part of it. If you're in recovery, you probably know this. Like, part of the hardest, is like, I got to deal with all this emotion. I got to deal with my past. I got to figure out all this trauma that I went through growing up in an alcoholic house, living with a father who beat his mom, living in the fear and the anxiety that went with that. That's some heavy duty stuff I can't figure out sitting on my couch. You guys get that? But it's not like it's not because, oh my gosh, I'm going to get high. It's because I got to go talk to somebody about this. And so that's two different things. Now, again, the stages and the dates and the times are kind of like different. The need to go back and do some earlier stuff. People sometimes fade away from meetings or they stop doing therapy. So we would say, you hear the phrase, go back to basics, get back on track. This is a good one, learning to avoid the creation of drama in your own life. Some of us are still working on that, right? You guys know what I mean by that, causing problems? Have you ever heard the term self-sabotage? Do you ever feel like you know somebody who's sort of like their own worst enemy and everything can be going okay and they'll just find a way to turn that thing upside down? And can you get to a point where you stop doing that and it's really just like, let's just try to be calm for a minute and lead just like a normal sort of content life? Why would a person in recovery, or even a family member, somebody was talking about being drawn to chaos or addicted to drama. Why would a person be addicted to that? What's that all about? Anybody have any theories or ideas on why would we create our own drama? It's natural why we do it when we're addicted, right? Because we are obsessed with the drug or we're obsessed with the drink, so we create our drama. Why would we do it when we're sober?
Attention getting.
It could be attention getting. It could be. What else? What? A learned behavior. You're used to it. You do it over and over again because you're used to it.
It avoids self-reflection and getting deep
yes, there's a lot of it that has to do with, I don't like calm. I would prefer for the chaos to be hitting the fan and to be operating in a crisis state than actually sitting here quietly with my own thoughts. Because it's a learned behavior as well. I'm not used to that. I'm more comfortable in the fight. I'm more comfortable in the chaos. Guys, when I got into recovery, man, I jumped into probably the hardest job on the face of the earth. I was a program director for an assertive community treatment team in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Mental health, deep end, severely, persistently mentally ill state hospital patients who have been released out into the community. It was in the era of, it's called deinstitutionalization. Empty out the state hospitals and get them into the community. It was a philosophical thing. This is like 2002. And my job was to run that team, okay? And we had to find folks. We had to find them under bridges. We had to find them in homeless encampments. We had to find them in different facilities. Chase them around the city of Pittsburgh. It was constant chaos. Any emergency room they showed up in Pittsburgh, we got called and we had to show up before the person could get admitted. Can you imagine that? I had to go in, at that time I had a bachelor's degree, and tell an MD, like, you're not allowed to admit them until I see them. And so you were on call and you were doing it. That freaking job, man, carried me through, right? It was constant like that. I never had to face anything. I was always responding to a crisis, and I was exceptional at it. But what's the problem? The crisis ends, and then you're left with yourself. You stop moving, and you're sitting in a chair, and it's Sunday afternoon, and you're like, nothing's happening. Everything's fine. Kids are fine. Wife's fine. Nothing's going on. Why do I feel like something terrible is coming? That's whenever, if you're not in the right space, you'll go create some drama for yourself. What do I mean by drama? I don't automatically mean that you're going to use. That's not what I mean. It could be drama in a lot of other ways. We can cause a lot of other problems without it being using. Hey, I'm going to go in and pick a fight about the toothpaste. Right? Or sometimes people do worse things. Do you guys get where I'm coming from? Family members can do this too. I think this was your point earlier where you were saying it feels weird to be like just kind of by myself and I'm not dealing with anything right now. You got to remember how used you are to that situation. You sort of thrive in chaos. And you're used to dealing with that stuff, and you're used to kind of pushing down on the crisis, and now all of a sudden it's not there, and your loved one's not here, and it's going to feel very, very strange. It'll feel very, very strange. Now, the idea would be the longer you deal with it, the longer you sit in it, the better you'll be able to deal with it. Anybody have any experiences they would share with that related to dealing with the calm and not creating drama? Anyone?
Yeah, I will.
Yes.
I recognize through really studying that calmness, what I was doing, sometimes I'll overeat, but another thing I'll do is I'll want to go out and spend money. And
That's a good one.
I don't need anything.
Yep.
I don't even know what I'm looking for. I just want to go out and get distracted, and I'll end up spending money on something I don't really need. And I'm aware of that now.
Yep.
I'm recognizing it.
Yeah. Spending money compulsively is a good example. You get into all the other process addictions. This is why some of the other addictions are so common when you talk about people who are in recovery. Things like internet pornography become a problem. Gambling become a problem. Gambling, if you've ever dealt with somebody who has a gambling disorder, I mean, it's actually, I would venture to say it's more destructive than even like a substance use. I mean, some of the worst situations I've ever dealt with in my practice have been gambling. That's very, very self-destructive and very addictive at a whole, kind of another level. Very dangerous too. It is. It really is. I have a person right now that I'm trying to kind of deal with related to that. It's and I got to tell you, man, my heart sinks for folks who are dealing with heroin and Xanax and stuff. My heart sinks for this situation too. I'm thinking okay, this is not going to end well. So. But it could also be more subtle things. It could just be picking fights. It could just be being discontent. But it's okay to be okay, is what we would say. It's all right to be okay. You're allowed to be calm. You're allowed to have nothing going on. The outer world of the person is beginning to reflect the inner world. This is, again, the idea that as you work on yourself, you start to treat the world differently. It would also go back to some of the stuff you were mentioning on how do people talk to you and how do people treat you. As you start to have serenity inside, people can see it. Have you ever seen anyone that you kind of look at and you sort of think that person is serene and content? And I mean, I'm sure you guys see that when you look at me.
Oh, yeah.
Calm. Very, very calm. Very quiet. You know, it's just like it reflects the outer world. Connections are made to a wider circle of people. This is important for a person in recovery. I'm sure it's the same thing with family members, but when you first get into recovery, what do? You sort of close your circle and you're around only people in recovery. Then as you stay in recovery for a while, you widen your circle and it's okay to be around other folks. This is also where you'll see people that are able to like kind of get back into the world, and maybe they're able to go to the wedding where alcohol is being served, or maybe they're able to go to the networking event after work. You kind of go back into the regular world, and there's an increase in honesty. What's interesting about honesty is you hear a lot of different ideas around recovery and honesty, and there's a lot of good stuff related to this. One is, don't tell lies because lies create stress and you have to cover it up, and then, as you're covering it up and you're worried and you're stressed, that increases the likelihood that you're going to use to deal with that. That's certainly one idea. The other thing that's interesting when you talk to people who kind of enter into recovery and they stick and stay, that little voice in our head comes back. That thing that has been labeled like your conscience. It doesn't feel good to behave that way anymore. Does that make sense? It's not about, am I going to get caught? So like for me today, honesty is not like, can I get away with it or not? Does that make sense? It's not that type of honesty. I'm not getting high anymore. I'm not taking away my feelings. I don't like the way I feel if I'm not being honest. It becomes more genuine. Stage 4 is called integration. And stage 4 is when the person moves to a level where it's just kind of like natural. It sort of is who they are. Again, I can't tell you the time frames for this. I bet you some people hit this real quick. For other people, maybe it takes 5 years. But at a certain point in time, the relapse rates just go way down. It's likely that you got this. It's just kind of who you are. A big deal is avoiding stuckness. This is a huge deal for people in recovery. I'm in recovery 18 years. I cannot today do what I did at day 18. Day 18, my recovery plan is completely different than what I do 18 years later. My world is pretty much therapy now, guys. Or I'll do now it's really more like executive coaching, to tell you the truth. I need to talk to people about the stress of running organizations and trying to find ways to get this done. That's my recovery plan. Early on, my recovery plan was a bunch of meetings, guys. I went to a meeting every single freaking day for years. I bet you I went to a meeting every day for 2 or 3 years. And